All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks so much for joining us today for our second Hot Topics in Fire Science and Stewardship webinar series. My name is Katie Lowe, and I'm the statewide coordinator for the UC ANR Fire Network. I'm pleased to be joined here today with our fire advisor, Luca Carpignani, and Max Moritz from UC ANR and Jane Cawson from the University of Melbourne. So with that, I will hand it over to Luca to introduce our speakers.
Yep. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today in this afternoon. And I'm Luca Carmignani. I'm a UC ANR Fire Advisor based in Southern California. And today's webinar will focus about plants flammability, which is a very interesting topic that intersects multiple fields from fire ecology, fire science, and even more practical like community wildfire preparedness. And I'm very excited to introduce the two speakers for today, Professor Cawson from University of Melbourne and Professor Moritz from UC Santa Barbara and UC Cooperative Extension Specialist. So I guess without further ado, I'll give the word to Jane. Who's going to go first.
Thanks, Luca. I'll just share my screen. Okay, well, hello everyone, and thanks a lot for having me along to this seminar. I'm based at the University of Melbourne in a research team called FLARE Wildfire Research. We're a fairly large group of scientists based across 3 different campuses. I've put a little star there on the map of Australia to show roughly where we are. And our research covers many different aspects of fire, as you can see listed there. My focus is mostly on landscape flammability. So this includes working closely with fire managers in southeastern Australia to help with fire prediction and fuel management. But today I'll be presenting some work we've done in the lab looking at plant flammability. And I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors who were working on this research with me, Jamie, B, and Alex. So Australia is a very flammable continent. This map here shows the extent of the black summer fire season, which occurred in 2019-2020, and it's one of the more notorious fire seasons in recent history. So the fires that made the headlines in the news that you might have heard about were down here in southeastern Australia, and these were unprecedented in their extent, with fires occurring all the way from southern Queensland down to Tasmania and also across here on Kangaroo Island in South Australia. But as you can see on this map, there was also quite a lot of fire up in northern Australia. This is actually just a fairly typical fire season in the north up here. So in Australia, we've got many different vegetation types. And we know that the properties of the vegetation influence the fire regime. In particular, there needs to be enough biomass or fuel to burn, and it needs to be dry enough to ignite. These properties vary between the ecosystems that you can see pictured here. And as a result, we have very different fire regimes in different parts of Australia. Another factor that also varies across these different ecosystems is species composition, both within the ecosystems and between the ecosystems. But how the species themselves differ in their flammability and the importance of this to flammability at landscape scales is far less understood. So we know that species burn differently, and these are a couple of videos I took a little while ago in a prescribed burn. So we've got under the same weather conditions, we can see very different flammabilities for 2 different species. So here we've got a surface fire burning underneath blanket leaf, and you can see that it's barely igniting at all, really just wilting the leaves and hardly igniting. In contrast, under very similar weather conditions, we've got surface fire beneath this Kunzia Aragoides, and we can see far more explosive fire behaviour here. So much bigger flames, much more higher rate of burning. So we can see that species burn differently, but quantifying this and identifying the key traits driving those differences remains a challenge. So broadly speaking, there's common agreement on what flammability means or its definitions. So flammability is the ability of vegetation to burn, most simply. And there's three different axes of flammability that are most commonly considered. First of all, ignitability, so how easily a fuel or a piece of vegetation ignites. Then it's combustibility, so the rate of burning, and then sustainability, so how long that vegetation takes to burn. So we've got common agreement over these different metrics, but from there it starts to get a little more confusing. And so therefore drawing broad conclusions about flammability is hampered by, across studies, a lack of consistency and comparability between data sets. And this is because people are using different metrics to measure these different flammability attributes. So here's some examples here of the different types of metrics that people are using. And very few studies will measure all of these metrics. So we really don't have a strong sense of how they compare, whether or not they're similar or not. Secondly, different studies are using different experimental apparatus, just whatever apparatus they happen to have available in their lab. And this means we'll have different heating environments which can influence the absolute measures of flammability. For example, ignitability will depend on the heat output of the ignition source. And combustibility is going to be higher if the plant is exposed to an external heat source for the duration of the experiment. Finally, there's also different scales of measurement occurring, and this is going to influence the importance of different vegetative traits to flammability. So we know that different traits of the plants influence flammability, but the influence of these traits varies depending on the scale of measurement. So a lot of studies occur at the leaf scale here. And at this scale, traits like the leaf surface area are important. But when we move up to the branch scale, it's not just the surface area of an individual leaf that we need to think about, but the surface area of all leaves combined on that branch, and even fine stems as well. And it's also the spatial arrangement of those leaves on the branch that we need to start taking into consideration. So these traits are still likely to be important at the scale of a whole vegetation community, but we also need to start looking at the interactions between species. So the general message here is that the importance of a particular trait varies depending on the spatial scale of measurement. And this is further complicating our ability to untangle the effects of species on the flammability of vegetation communities. So in this research, we weren't trying to resolve all of that, but with those issues in mind, we were trying to find a pathway towards greater consistency in future flammability research. And we did that by considering a number of different flammability metrics and a number of different plant traits within the same study for the same set of species. And by doing that, we hope to be able to identify which metrics might be suitable to use across multiple flammability studies so that we can start having more consistency across the studies and more comparability. And we also hope to determine the relative importance of different traits on flammability.
What do you need?
So we did this by collecting plant specimens in the field and burning them in the lab. So these photos here illustrate the range of forest structures and compositions that we sampled from. We focused on collecting the dominant understory species because they're most likely to influence the flammability of the site. This table here just shows the different species that we looked at, and you can see that they cover a range of different growth forms, from tall shrubs to small shrubs, tree ferns, ground ferns, and ground creepers. In each instance, we collected samples that were 40 centimetres long. We took those samples back to our fire lab and burnt them in this custom-designed variable heat flux apparatus. So there's lots of different equipment that's used to measure flammability. The advantages of this piece of equipment is it simulates, it can measure flammability at the branch scale, and it also simulates more equipment, real fire. So the here approaches the plant sample like an approaching fire front, and we can set that to different fire intensities. It stays up at the plant for 2 minutes before receding backwards again. And then we have here a pilot igniter, which is sort of like a surface fire. So we measure different flammability, mass loss over time, heat flux, and other variables like flame length. So we considered a range of flammability metrics to find the optimal one. So you can see here a few metrics under each of those broad flammability attributes. And we used a set of criteria to evaluate those metrics. So these are the criteria here. So first of all, we wanted to find metrics that could differentiate between the species in terms of their flammability. Metrics that were strongly correlated with the most fundamental metric for each flammability attribute. So those are highlighted here just based on the literature. And we also wanted metrics that we thought would be measurable using most experimental apparatus and measurable at different scales so that lots of people can use these metrics in their studies. And so the metrics highlighted here in blue are the ones we identified as the preferred flammability metrics based on the data we collected. So in terms of ignitability, we chose time to ignition because the probability of ignition provided little differentiation between species at the scale of the measurements we were doing and for the species we were looking at. In terms of combustibility, we found that the peak heat release rate, which was that fundamental measure of combustibility, was highly correlated with the median heat release rate. So you could actually use either. But unfortunately, the flame length, which would be a lot easier to measure across different scales and with different experimental apparatus, was only weakly correlated with the heat release metrics. So therefore, that's why we chose the peak heat release rate, even though it's a little more difficult to measure. And then in terms of sustainability, we found that total heat release was highly correlated with flame duration. And so we've opted for the simpler metric to measure their flame duration. So we used these flammability metrics to and linked them to different plant traits to see which traits might be most influential for flammability. And you can see these traits can be split up into a couple of leaf scale traits, but mostly branch scale measures there. Overall, we found that there was a range of growth forms at the lower end of the flammability spectrum. So it's not just one sort of growth form or type of plant. So we had like creepers here. This is Platylobium obtuse angulum. We had ground ferns and also this sort of spindly looking shrub here. So all these species were slow to ignite, had a low peak heat release rate and short flaming duration. So they were at the lower end of the flammability spectrum. At the upper end of the flammability spectrum, we also saw a range of different growth forms. So these species are broadly faster to ignite, have a high peak heat release rate and a longer flaming duration. And interestingly, up at that higher end, we've got the tree fern, you can see here, which is actually only really occurs in gullies and wetter parts of the landscape, yet it was one of the most flammable species. So what traits most strongly influence flammability? So in terms of ignitability, we looked at all those different traits and we found that branch total surface area was the strongest predictor. So you can see with this graph here, as the surface area increases, the time to ignition decreases. So we're getting more ignitable plant specimens. So this could be species with large leaves or fronds, or it could be branches that have many, many tiny leaves adding up to a high total surface area. So when you've got more surface area, there's more exposure to radiant heating. So you've got a higher concentration of pyrolysis gases being produced, more efficient moisture loss, and this leads to faster ignition. In terms of combustibility, the strongest predictor was branch biomass. So you can see there with biomass increasing, the peak heat release rate is also increasing there. So as you've got more biomass, there's more energy that could potentially be released. And this could encompass a range of different growth forms. So it could be a small number of large leaves or many small leaves. For sustainability, the amount of biomass was also the strongest predictor. So you can see there the flaming duration increasing as you've got increasing biomass, which makes sense. More biomass means it's going to take longer to burn. Importantly, the peak heat release rate and the flaming duration were highly correlated with each other. So this suggests that you could just use one of those metrics, not both. So in summary, we've still got a long way to go in terms of understanding more about plant flammability, but this study has identified a set of flammability metrics that could be used with different equipment and at different scales, helping to make different research studies more comparable. So those metrics were time to ignition, peak heat release rate, and flaming duration. And we found that branches with more surface area and a higher biomass are more flammable, but many more species need to be studied in order to confirm this and explore the effects of other traits as well. Interestingly, the most flammable plants were not necessarily those found in the driest part of the landscape, which is what we saw with that tree fern. And if you want to find out more, please have a look at our paper, which came out late last year. So what we didn't address in this study was flammability at the scale of the vegetation community. At this scale, we need to consider how the individual plant species contribute to the structure and moisture status of the vegetation community. So I'm going to leave you with this one last thought and these two contrasting photos to ponder. So the photo on the left here, one of the dominant species is Platylobium obtuse angulum, which is a pretty cool name. That was the creeper that we found that was actually quite low in terms of its flammability, one of the least flammable species. But as you can see in this photo, perhaps its interaction at the scale of the vegetation community could mean it's increasing the flammability, because although this plant might not be flammable on its own, it is acting to connect the different plants horizontally within that vegetation community, and also helping to suspend dead material above the forest floor. On the other hand, in this photo here, we've got the tree ferns, which were one of the most flammable species, but in a vegetation community, they are creating quite a lot of shade with their large fronds, which could be creating a moist microclimate and higher fuel moisture contents on the forest floor, which might be reducing the ignitability of the forest as a whole. So as you can see, we've got a long way to go in terms of understanding how species influence flammability in the vegetation community, but it's certainly an interesting area to be exploring. Thanks for having me and listening to me. Please get in touch with any questions, or we can chat after this.
Thank you, Jane, for the awesome presentation. And just as a reminder, we're going to have the second presentation, then question and answers at the end. So we're going to have the second speaker, Professor Moritz from UC Santa.
Okay, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Well, thank you. I think you'll see some overlapping themes with Jane's talk, and maybe some interesting differences. So yeah, I am a cooperative extension wildfire specialist, a statewide position. And if you are part of extension, you get asked a lot about what should I plant in my garden around my home. It's a question, whether you're dealing with the Fire Safe Council or FireWise type training and education, it comes up constantly. And this is just a couple of books which are more or less standardized or rigorous in how they treat this. I'm not going to incriminate myself by saying which is which, but there is a huge variety in the amount of scientific and research backing that goes into some of these types of lists, which is a little disconcerting, but it also is great motivation for all of the work that we're trying to do on flammability. All right. So when I started ages ago in grad school in the 90s, I used to see these live fuel moisture graphs that were put out by the agencies, the Forest Service. And they basically would show the long-term average. So in this case, this is where we are right now. This is the latest from a nearby county. It's showing kind of the buildup in fuel moisture or vegetation foliar moisture content up through May, right, through the current month. And then here's this long-term average, this green longer plot, which is based on, maybe 10 or 20 years of data. And when I used to look at these, it intrigued me because I never saw anybody analyzing these data, for one. And they always made a big deal out of when live fuel moistures reached this critical level, this 60%. This is this red line across the bottom here. And that's when the fire season became critical, and you'd actually hear about it in public service announcements. So I was always intrigued by this, and what this was actually based on, you know. And so years later, I was able to embark on some work with a colleague, Phil Dennison. This was about 15 years ago, where we took all of the fire history for Los Angeles County, the region south of where I am right now, for what was it, 20, looks like about 25 years or so, and all of the live fuel moisture sampling data that was collected in this same region. So basically every 2 weeks, the agencies would go out to these different sampling locations, take clippings of the vegetation, bring it back, weigh it when it's wet and fresh, dry it in an oven, and then weigh it again and figure out the moisture content. And that's what gives you LFM, live fuel moisture. It's actually the amount of water divided by the dry mass. And we use those historical records to see, is this 60% live fuel moisture really something that shows up in the data? How does fire activity respond? And what we found, and these 4 figures just reflect different buffer distances between the live fuel moisture sampling locations and the fires. So basically the upper left one here, A, only fires that were within 5 kilometers of a live fuel moisture sampling station were allowed into that analysis. And B, 10 kilometers, C, 15, D, 20. So basically more and more fires are being allowed into the analysis. At some point you would say, okay, that fire way over there shouldn't be related to that live fuel moisture sampling that happened way over there. And so you would toss it out. But this is just looking at different buffer distances. And you see the same basic dynamics that at very high LFM, very moist vegetation early in the fire season, you see very few fires, and they don't add up to very much, right? This is a cumulative area burned on the y-axis. And as the season progresses and vegetation dries out, you have live fuel moisture getting lower and lower and lower, more fires. They still aren't very big. They're not adding up to much. And then you hit some sort of a threshold, right? And at this inflection point, which according to these data in this part of the world is in the high 70s, 6, 7, 8, 9, you get a jump in the numbers and sizes of fires. And this was kind of interesting because it contradicted the 60% critical. It showed that actually it appears that you can have some sort of a critical shift in your fire regime at substantially higher and more moist vegetation. Some other things that did show up, though, is that at 60, at the very low end, you do see a cluster. So for example, in this A panel, you do see a cluster of fires way up here that appears to be kind of associated with roughly a 60% live fuel moisture. But it looks like there is a threshold and it's higher than 60. So this motivated some interest and ongoing studies. More recently, we have talked to some of the fire agency folks here locally, and they are advocating for shaded fuel breaks of native oak trees. And the historical observations, anecdotal historical observations around here are that often when fire hits these stands, because there's less fuel underneath them, but also because these are deeply rooted trees and they tend to have a higher foliar moisture throughout the fire season, they just don't burn very readily. We had an actual example of this just a couple of years ago. We had a fire, downslope wind-driven fire, very high winds, our local sundowner winds. And it burned straight into a stand of coast live oaks that was not maintained as a shaded fuel break, but it burned right into a stand of coast live oaks. It burned 20 to 50 meters in, and then it basically went out on its own. A wind-driven fire in a very dry part of the year. And if this had not been here, it would have continued on into this neighborhood, basically. So this shaded fuel break idea works. Part of the story here is probably a moisture story, right? Because we have data from these local stands where we have the green line, or the upper line here, shows the coast live oaks being pretty constant in their live fuel moisture and relatively high compared to the local shrublands, which are below them, lower live fuel moisture. They do bump up during the rainy season to be more moist than the oaks. But overall, during the fire season, it looks like part of this is a moisture story that is driving flammability. So again, interesting anecdotes and questions. Some of the things that I want to touch on briefly and show you some studies on. I don't think we have a good answer of whether it's species or hydration yet. We've seen some interesting results that lead us to believe that sometimes species matter, other times they don't. Sometimes it's the water status. Sometimes it doesn't appear to be as important. As Jane mentioned, the methodology is super important. As we started into this, we realized, wait, okay, you know, we're getting different results from other people. We tried a couple different methods, and it really highlights the importance of standardizing and comparable approaches. And then some other factors. What about things like VOCs, volatile organic compounds, those aromatics that you can smell in some plants and not others? Those appear to be probably important factors that we're not quite able to measure and deal with yet. We did a comparison of methodologies. There's this epiradiator approach to flammability testing, which is in the upper panel here. This is just a very hot surface that many flammability tests use. You put a very small amount of vegetation. So this also gets at the difference in scale. This is sort of a leaf scale, right? Just a little bit of a twig and some leaves. It has direct contact with the heating element. So, right, it's conductive heat transfer as opposed to some other modes of heat transfer. And then you can measure the time to ignition, et cetera, et cetera. The lower panel here, the lower image, is a different approach that we've tried based on a hot plate, which gets very hot, and sort of a metal screen over that. So you don't have as much conductive heat transfer. It's a little bit more radiative or convective. And this also has a pilot ignition. Jane showed us a piloted ignition, but this is above the sample. So as the sample heats up, it volatilizes and then ignites as those fumes hit the pilot ignition, or at least that's the theory behind these. And we tried some tests comparing these methods, and what we found, sorry, this is a little bit too much to put on a graph, but if you are on one slide, but if you look at just the left-hand column here, the two methods, the epiradiator and the hot plate method, those are those two straight lines being shown on each of these figures. Flame height, flame duration, glow duration, post-flame glow. And thankfully, the two methods line up. The slopes are the same for these two approaches. And this is all based on dry weight, the dry mass of the sample. On the right-hand side, you see differing relationships from these methodologies, right? They're either flat or they're conflicting, which is worrisome, really. And this is based on variables that relate to the moisture content. Water potential is an ecophysiological measurement. You clip a living piece of vegetation and you expose it to pressure, and you see how much pressure it takes to press the water out of it. So it's a measure of drought stress. And zero here would be zero drought stress, and increasing as you go negative on the water potentials. But the point here is that the methodologies actually differ in the relationships. And part of this is this ignition, the method of ignition, we believe is what's giving us these different results. So again, kind of echoing Jane's point, standardizing some of the methodology is quite important. We have bought into the same four kind of axis as most other people have, way of recognizing or grouping flammability. Here are some of the things that we have mentioned or we have measured to try to capture those. We have also kind of collapsed these into sort of a principal components type of of analysis to see where they overlap and where they don't. Just some brief results from this study. We've got an upper panel here of one shrub and a lower panel of another common shrub in chaparral shrublands, very flammable plant community. The upper panel here is Ceanothus megacarpus. The panel A here is showing an ignitability proxy, basically, and B is just raw time to ignition. And these basically show the relationship that you would expect, right? Ignitability decreasing or taking longer with higher foliar moisture, with LFM here on the x-axis. There is a threshold, it appears. They're not very strong thresholds, but there is a threshold at a quite high LFM for both of these ignition-related variables. It's somewhere above 100% LFM, which is quite moist. If we look at chamise or Adenostoma fasciculatum, we see similarly a very high threshold in both of these ignition-related variables that is above or right around 100% LFM. The other things that we see on these figures is a green line, which is called the Turgor loss point or the wilting point of this particular species. So these ignition thresholds tend on average to be quite a bit higher than the wilting point of these species. There are also some other metrics here, time to first glow, maximum temperature, et cetera, et cetera. And these tend to be down at a drier point, closer to that 60% LFM that we heard about earlier. That's sort of from the professional experience of firefighters. So anyway, this is all based on very small segments of vegetation being tested. So species does appear to matter somewhat, and it does matter which flammability parameter we're actually looking at. In application, we've started to work with the Botanic Garden actually locally, because they sell plants and they want to know, can we put a rating on these plants in our nursery? And so we've started working with them. This is a slightly different ignition methodology. This is a hot wire ignition run above the heated sample, like running electricity through a metal wire to create a very hot ignition source, as opposed to the Bunsen burner type piloted ignition in the previous one. And what we're getting from this is a look at time to ignition, right, or proportion igniting. And we can say something actually about the plants that they're selling in the nursery, and say something about the ignitability given the same, more or less the same water status. I also want to, I should probably go back, recognize, I'll do that at the end, some of the students that have been involved in this. This is Christina Faust, who's working on this. We've got some landscape scale analyses to sort of take another pass at that earlier threshold analysis that I showed from 2009, which motivated some of this interest. We've basically looked at live fuel moisture patterns through time across all of chamise's distribution, across all of Southern California, and all of the fires that have occurred through time, where we have data for this modeled live fuel moisture pattern. And we actually start to see kind of an interesting 3-domain system, or 2 different thresholds. Basically, as the season progresses and fuels dry out, you do see an initial kind of inflection, and that's in the high to mid to high 70% LFM. So this is probably an ignition threshold, right? You're starting to see fires that actually ignite more easily and burn more area in this middle range. And then you start to see sort of a large fire dynamic threshold at this 60% LFM, 61 in this case. But we've looked at cumulative area burned, mean fire size, numbers of fires, and actually we see the same thing over and over, that there's a 3-domain or 2 threshold pattern here. The higher fuel moisture one appears to be an ignition limitation. And then, and that seems to vary from 75 to 95% live fuel moisture, There's a broader range there. And then there appears to be a pretty consistent secondary threshold at a drier later part of the season, right around 60% LFM, where you start to get a big jump in the sizes and area burned, cumulative area burned sizes and numbers of fires at the landscape scale. So some of those thresholds that we're seeing at the leaf scale and the twig scale actually help us understand what we're seeing at the landscape scale too. It's not a perfect match, but they're starting to line up and tell us something about which species ignite more easily and burn hotter at different points in the fire season and different moisture levels. So going back to the questions, I don't think we know. Species seem to be important, so is hydration. And what the other factors, volatile organic compounds, those aromatics are probably also important. And again, echoing one of Jane's points, we really do need to standardize methods and figure out how to produce results that are comparable from study to study so that we can say something a little more consistent and conclusive about what we are finding. And that's it.
All right. Thank you, Max, for the great presentation. So now it's time for the questions. And if anybody has a question and wants to type it in the chat, and can be for like one speaker or both speakers. Can give it a second. Well, while we wait, I guess I have question for Jane, but it's also like for Max. So in terms of like these tests, how do we take into account the seasonality of the plants? Because of course, like moisture content varies with season, but also the biomass. We're gonna have new green material in the spring usually, or like more dead biomass in some other parts of the year. So how can we take that into account?
I guess at the moment we just focused on sampling in the fire season, and then we actually fully hydrated the samples before we burnt them, so we're not taking that into account at all. So I guess you'd need to collect samples at different times throughout the season to really capture the seasonal effects.
And I would say the same thing, Luca. We did actually try to sample across the fire season. And we also did something similar where you would clip the vegetation, bring it back and hydrate it fully, and then actually dry it down, do a benchtop dry down to actually get some ecophysiological measurements like turgor loss point and things like that. And we burned them at different levels of drought stress. So a lot of those points were actually different levels of drought stress. And you see quite a bit of variation. You see a lot of response in some species to drought stress and less in others. Something interesting is that we've seen for the same level of drought stress, but differing amounts of rainfall. We've seen the preceding season's rainfall actually appear to be important too, even given the same amount of drought stress that you're testing at. So following a wet season versus following a dry season also seems to be important. And that, that hints at plant chemistry and, and other things playing some role that we don't understand yet.
Got it. Thanks. Guess we have time for some more questions from Hadi. Question for Jane and Max. Have you tried determining a fire index, for example, combustion index, based on factors like fuel moisture content, flame duration, time to ignition, flame height, etc.?
Well,
yeah, not really based on those variables. But although there are fire danger ratings, I suppose we've got in Australia that factor in some of those variables. Fuel moisture content, definitely, flame heights, that sort of thing. Likelihood of ignition. Yeah.
And so we had the same four, bins of flammability, the flammability components, and we collected a handful of metrics for each, if we could. And we tried to actually come up with some kind of an index by applying principal components analysis to those different characteristics to see if they did collapse into something like an index. And we got some indication that it might work. We haven't done anything, that translates from study to study or plant to plant. Yeah.
Okay. And then we have another question for both. Since all the plants from Alice, since all the plants ultimately can burn, will it ever make sense really to talk about fire-resistant plants? Should we focus instead in our advice or not planting plants that are highly flammable instead, such as juniper, rosemary, Italian cypress?
Yeah, I think that would
Probably.
make sense.
Yes. I think this goes back to many conversations that we've had amongst cooperative extension folks, saying, shouldn't we get away from these fire-resistant plant lists and focus more on a handful of no-nos? Like, these are really bad ideas, right? And some very clear guidance on spacing and maintenance and watering, because those are the kinds of things that actually really are probably more in our control and more. But that said, people want lists. They have their plants that they like, and they want to know if this is more or less flammable than that. And so we're trying to meet a need, right?
Yeah, and as an advisor, you mentioned a good point that, maintenance, spacing, and irrigation are very important factors. And even if a plant is deemed non-flammable, if you have a lot of that materials accumulating, that it can create a big issue. And I guess we have time for a couple more questions from Marilyn. What about accommodating in a methodology fresh cut leaves versus debris duff? For example, finding that E. globulus leaves on the tree resist catching fire, but once on the ground, protective exterior breaks down and they become highly flammable. Sorry, I can't read again the question, but basically it's like, what about the tree versus the leaves that fall on the ground?
Yeah, absolutely. We need to consider the litter bed flammability as well. And we do. And like, a lot of our research is actually focused on litter bed flammability and the properties that make a species more or less flammable on a standing plant or on a branch will act differently in a litter bed. So yeah, we need to consider that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. We're focusing mostly on live fuel, moisture, and other characteristics of living plants. So we're focusing less on duff, but it's certainly important in litter. Yeah.
Okay, one more question from Alice. One common thought out in public is that since native plants are well adapted to our climate, they tend to hold their moisture better and can be more fire resistant than typical ornamentals. Do you think there's any merit to that?
A good question. I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's always going to be a good assumption, from plant to plant. I really don't. Because, for example, in our part of the world, we have salvias, sages, and they're very aromatic, and it turns out they're really ignitable. And they're natives, and they're great, very drought resistant. And there's other natives that are very drought resistant that aren't quite as flammable.
Yeah, because also another tricky part is that we get into like fire regimes, how those plants evolved with fire too. So that's, another tricky point. And one question for Dan, has anyone examined whether defoliation via grazing or other mechanism changes fuel moisture?
I mean, it would definitely change flammability because you're reducing the amount of biomass, and there's lots, and grazing is one way of managing fuel and flammability in the landscape. But Max, you might know about the live fuel moisture. I don't know about that.
Well, that's an interesting question. I haven't seen any interaction, study that would look at the interaction, but it does make some sense that if you have a grazed if you're grazing a shrub, for example, what's going to grow back is going to be new, young fuel and maybe less older, more woody fuel. So it is conceivable that a useful interaction there, but I don't think we have great info on it. It's a good question.
Great. And the last question from Bruno, this is the last question, then we'll let you go, guys. Are any of the methods used for lab testing equivalent to ember ignition in the environment?
Oh, yeah, I could actually answer that one because I could have done a whole separate seminar on that because we've done quite a lot of work looking at ember ignitions in the field and the lab and developing a lab method that has comparability to what we see in the field. So yeah, there are methods for looking at mostly in litter beds, ignitability under different moisture contents.
Okay. Very quickly, I know a student that I'm working with who has tried to simulate the idea of say sparks landing in vegetation or contact from a hot, if somebody pulls over in a car and a hot exhaust system touches something, by heating up metal ball bearings, heating them up and then dropping them into the plant kind of as a surrogate for that, for ember ignition or spark ignition.
Well, a lot of food for thoughts and a lot of open questions, but I would like to thank you again, the speakers, Professor Jane Cawson from University of Melbourne and Professor Moritz from Cooperative Extension in UC Santa Barbara. And I would like to thank all of the audience as well for sticking to this webinar. And I don't know if Katie, you want to make a final announcement?
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much to our speakers and Luca for facilitating. Our next Hot Topics webinar is going to be next Wednesday, June 12th from 12 to 12:45 p.m. Pacific, and it will feature some research from colleagues up in Oregon. So we're going to be talking about fire history in ecosystems in Oregon and also fire hazard mapping and maybe lessons that we as Californians can learn from what they've done up there. So all that can be found on our Fire Network website, ucanr.edu/site/fire. And the recording of this webinar, as well as other webinars in this series, will be made available on our YouTube channel, and that's searchable at UC ANR Fire Network. So thank you so much, everyone, and we'll hopefully see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.